Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video because I thought that it was very particularly interesting. And what this video is going to be about is that this is going to be me discussing the possibility of the future number one pound for pound fighter in the world. And I think that it's going to be a very interesting argument over these next few years about who is going to be the number one pound for pound or who is debatably going to be in that conversation at the moment in time when we talk about who is going to be the at least definitive number one pound for pound fighter. And I've said this repeatedly within my most recent videos. I believe that Mr. Canelo Alvarez is the current number one pound for pound fighter. And I'm not the only one that has that opinion. Of course, a lot of these channels out here, they'll try to make you believe that the only reason why Mr. Canelo Alvarez, the only reason why he's ranked as the number one pound for pound fighter is because he's quote unquote European when it comes down to it, and old media just wants someone overall like that to be the number one pound for pound. And I understand, why certain people are saying that. I get it. Am I saying that certain things like that have not happened in the past? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. But when it comes down to when you take a look at Mr. Canelo Alvarez, I do truly believe that he is the current number one pound for pound fighter, and I don't think that it really can even be a debate. However, there is a couple of fighters that maybe you could debate as maybe later on, maybe surpassing Canelo, where, if they were to win certain fights, at least being in the same discussion. I still think that it's going to be a very big hill for them to climb, just because Canelo Alvarez usually fights very decent competition. Of course, his next bout is going to be that over Dimitri Bivol. And I thought that I would compare the Canelo Alvarez versus Dimitri Bivol fight to that maybe of Terence Bud Crawford with whatever opponent that he's going to be facing next. Now, if Terence Bud Crawford, within his next fight, ends up facing that of an Errol Spence Jr., I think that you could possibly debate that, probably debate that as the better fight, the bigger fight overall, or the more challenging fight than that of Canelo versus Dimitri Bivol, even though there still would be some people that would debate that Canelo versus Dimitri Bivol would be the more challenging fight. Some people would debate that. What I'll say is this: both Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., they're both within my top 5 pound for pound. So, of course, I would probably argue that Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence would be that of the more challenging fight. But Canelo Alvarez, to be fair to him, he did overall end up getting that victory over a top 5 pound for pound fighter not too long ago over Gennady Golovkin in that rematch. So to be fair to Canelo Alvarez, one maybe could debate that Canelo has already been there and done that. However, what I will say is this: in that first fight, it was extremely competitive. In the second fight, it was extremely competitive as well. And a lot of people, including myself, thought that Canelo Alvarez should not have gotten a draw in that first fight against Gennady Golovkin. That more than likely all in all that it should have been scored for Gennady Golovkin. So if Terence Crawford does go into the ring with that of an Errol Spence Jr., even if maybe you want to argue that Errol Spence hasn't looked maybe quite like the old one, but even if you were to make that point, I still think that I would debate that Errol Spence is clearly still one of the top 10, probably top 5 pound for pound fighters in the world of boxing today. If Terence Bud Crawford is able to be extraordinarily dominant or extremely dominant over that of Errol Spence Jr., I think all in all that you certainly would have a debate, finally have a debate, a legitimate debate, in my opinion, of Terence Bud Crawford being the number one pound for pound fighter, the true number one pound for pound fighter. Because, of course, there's a lot of people that try to debate that Terence Bud Crawford is debatably the number one pound for pound fighter right now, and I understand where people are coming from. When you take a look at Terence Bud Crawford, even if you're going to compare him to Errol Spence Jr. or Tyson Fury or Alexander Usyk or, Lomachenko when he was, debatably number one pound for pound, or Canelo Alvarez, even if you compare him to any of those fighters, you could maybe say that in terms of boxing skills, maybe if you truly wanted to debate it, that maybe even Terence Bud Crawford comes out on top, even against those fighters. I'm not sure if I would 100% allege that myself, but I understand where people are coming from. But the problem is with Terence Bud Crawford is that even though I think he's a tremendous fighter, I can't put you at the number one pound for pound spot because the best fighter that you've ever beaten, the greatest fighter that you've ever beaten, was a Sean Porter that didn't have a title at the time, and on top of that already had been defeated by pretty much the other creme de la creme boxers at 147. Now, don't get me wrong, I still give Terence Bud Crawford a hell of a lot of credit for defeating Sean Porter in the way that he did. But when we talk about overall the future number one pound for pound, I do think that we do have to compare things somewhat logically and objectively here. We do have to break them down with context. I think that if Terence Bud Crawford defeats that of Errol Spence Jr., and then from what I'm hearing also with rumors, maybe after that he'll go up to 154, or maybe he'll go up to 154 anyways, because maybe let's just say the Errol Spence Jr. fight doesn't happen. he'll go up, possibly face Jermell Charlo and beat him. That would be an extraordinary fight as well. However, what I will say is this. In my view, for Terence Bud Crawford to surpass Canelo Alvarez as the current #1 pound-for-pound fighter, there's only one fight, in my opinion, that is even going to make that possible if he wants to surpass Canelo Alvarez as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, and maybe even surpass a couple of other people on my list, because right now, I think I have Terence Crawford at about #4, and I think that that's fair, and some people may ask, well, why do you have him at #4? The reason why I have him at #4 is because when I take a look at Alexander Usyk, Tyson Fury, and Canelo Alvarez, and I know some people, they're going to take a look at me and say, oh, well, what's up with, putting the European fighters or, some of these Caucasian fighters, ahead of Terence Crawford. Well, at the end of the day, I think overall that there's a realistic, point overall to putting those fighters that high. Why is that? Because when you talk about Canelo Alvarez, his resume is pretty much out of this world. When you talk about Alexander Usyk, he has that 50-50 win over Anthony Joshua. When you talk about Tyson Fury, he has the wins over Vladimir Klitschko and Deontay Wilder. The thing is about Terence Crawford is that even though I think he's a phenomenal fighter, when we really take a look back on his wins, is Victor Postol really someone that we would count as, debatably, even at his best in his career, a possible top 10 or top 20 pound-for-pound fighter? I don't know if I would. Maybe Yuriorkis Gamboa, at the time, certain people maybe would have debated top 10, top 20, but I think that Gamboa was always a person with a great amount of holes in his game. But, let me give Terence Bud Crawford that much credit. And Sean Porter at the time certainly would have not been top 10 pound-for-pound, but maybe top 30. So Terence Crawford does deserve, in his own way, a certain amount of respect. He does deserve overall, maybe in some right, somewhat of #1 pound-for-pound acclaim. I just can't overall put him on the same level as some of those other guys, especially that of Azul Canelo Alvarez. But I just thought that I would talk about this video because it's going to be very interesting to see what Terence Bud Crawford does within these next few years. It's going to be very interesting to see who he fights. And in my opinion, there's one fight that he needs to take definitively in order to raise not only his possible pound-for-pound status, but also his all-time legacy. And that is that Errol Spence Jr. fight. He is going to have to take that fight. So we'll see on the know what happens. But anyways, we're going to see what Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation has to say. Let's get into it.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? Man, oh man, things are really starting to heat up right now, boy. They really starting to heat up. Because Terence Crawford, pound for pound, the best fighter in the world, a man who is always trying to challenge himself. He's always trying to take on the biggest challenges. We all know.
Well, I would love to say that about Terence Bud Crawford. I like Terence Bud Crawford. I love watching him. I think that he is truly a great fighter and a phenomenal fighter. But can I really say that about someone that did not seem overall too hot about signing with the PBC when basically all the other top contenders were there? That's not me necessarily saying that Terence Bud Crawford is afraid of any of those guys. But all that is me saying is that maybe Terence Crawford could have pulled some smarter moves in his career. It just is what it is. But I have yet to see Terence Bud Crawford be a true top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. Really, to be honest with you, I have yet to see Terence Bud Crawford truly defeat a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. That's why when a lot of people, they'll take a look at my pound-for-pound list and they'll say, oh, well, you kind of have Terence Crawford a little bit too low. Or, oh, you tripping, when it comes out, you should have Terence Bud Crawford as, at least #2. And I understand people's points, but at the end of the day, Fury, Alexander Usyk, and Canelo Alvarez, there is no debate about this. All those fighters, debatably, at least on some sort of list, defeated a clear top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. Alexander Usyk has that win over Anthony Joshua. When it comes down to it, whether you want to say that he's the most skilled heavyweight or not, Alexander Usyk was about 20 pounds lighter than him. He defeated Anthony Joshua at the best point in his career, and really he embarrassed him. Does Terence Crawford really have a win that is that impactful at that point in time in his career? I'm not so sure about that. It just is what it is. Tyson Fury was able to defeat Deontay Wilder, who, like I said, never would have been within my top 10 pound-for-pound, but he would have been within my top 20. Does Terence Crawford even have a victory in his career like that? I'm not so sure about that. Now, some people may say, well, I believe that the Sean Porter win is greater than Deontay Wilder win. Maybe you could debate that, but in my view, I would maybe put Deontay Wilder in terms of impact maybe above a Sean Porter. Would I say that Deontay Wilder is on the same league as Sean Porter? Maybe not, but Sean Porter was pretty much a person that was known to losing every big fight in his career anyway, or to every big fighter that he ever fought pretty much anyway. So you can somewhat maybe debate that they're on the same level, but Tyson Fury also defeated Vladimir Klitschko, one of the all-time great fighters, when he, I believe, was in the top 5 pound for pound. And when you talk about Canelo Alvarez, I mean, forget it. There's Gennady Golovkin, there's Lara, there's overall Austin Trout, there's there's overall Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith. Now he's facing Dimitri Bivol, who, in my opinion, is personally a top 20 pound for pound fighter. So, like I said, Terence Crawford, he has a little bit more proving to do.
He's been wanting the Errol Spence fight for nearly 2 years now, and he's going to most likely get it, because I truly believe that Errol Spence, especially after Errol Spence just recently came out and he said, to my fault, all the split talk, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to negotiate because the fight needs to happen. This is what Errol Spence said in his very last interview, right? So because he said that, I truly believe that both Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, they know that that fight has to happen. They know that nobody wants to see any other fight but that fight at 147. With that being said, Terence Crawford did say, if I cannot get the Spence fight, I'm moving up and I want the winner of Charlo Castaño. These are things that Crawford wants to do, because this is the confidence of a man who believes he is the best fighter in the world. I mean, Terence Crawford is already in the deepest division in boxing, the glamour division, 147, right? Where he most likely is going to be fighting against another guy that's on the pound for pound list, arguably top 3 pound for pound list, Errol Spence. Assuming Errol
Spence at the current moment in time is number 5 on my pound for pound list, but he is a phenomenal fighter. And even if you were going to argue that maybe Errol Spence, that maybe the alcohol and a couple of other things got to him, Errol Spence is still at a very decent point in his career. Of course, we will see all in all how he performs against Yordenis Ugas. If Errol Spence looks very, very different in that fight, and then overall the Terence Crawford fight happens, and then Terence Crawford dominates him, then we may have something overall that is a little bit of a different situation. But more than likely, if Terence Crawford defeats Errol Spence Jr., I'm going to give him all the credit in the world. I'm not a person that degrades overall certain performances unless I think a fighter is nowhere near the same what they used to be. And we'll see. Because Errol Spence has suffered some injuries when it comes down to it. He has overall, suffered certain things. He was in that car accident. I've heard certain people say that they didn't think that Errol Spence looked the same in that last performance against Danny Swift Garcia. I personally somewhat disagreed, because I think Errol Spence looked phenomenal in that comeback fight. But we're going to see all in all, once and for all, where Errol Spence is at in that Yordenis Ugas fight. That fight, I believe, that happens next month. So we're going to see anyway.
This gets past Ugas, which is no guarantee. But my point is, Crawford's plan is to fight against a pound-for-pound top 3 fighter to become undisputed at 147, then move up and fight another fighter on the top pound-for-pound list to become undisputed in another very deep division. This is what Terence Crawford wants to do.
If Terence Crawford does end up doing that, let me say this, it would be very hard to deny him the number 1 pound-for-pound spot, in my opinion, if he were able to do both of those things, especially within the next couple of fights. Especially if Terence Bud Crawford remains undefeated, it's going to be very, very tough. But what I will say is this. Let's just say Terence Bud Crawford just faces Jermell Charlo next. And let's just say all in all that he ends up defeating him when it comes down to it. And all in all, people may ask, well, what do you think about Terence Crawford now? Do you think all in all that he now surpasses Canelo Alvarez on the pound for pound list? No, personally, overall, I don't. I don't think all in all that Terence Bud Crawford defeating Jermell Charlo, I don't think all in all that would put him over Canelo Alvarez on my pound for pound list. Now, some of you may ask, why is that? Because I don't think all in all that a win over Jermell Charlo in the first place is really an A+ win to begin with. And I said this all in all even about Brian Castano. I said that even whoever the winner of that fight is, in my opinion, because even though I think both of those fighters are very decent fighters, I don't think that either or of those fighters are really A+ fighters. To be honest with you, I'm not really even sure if Jermell Charlo or Brian Castano really have the boxing pedigree of what a Caleb Plant had. And I know a certain amount of people, they're going to laugh at me and they're going to say, oh, well, you just sound like you're sticking up for Canelo Alvarez. Well, that's not overall what I'm trying to do here. But when I take a look at Brian Castano and Jermell Charlo, listen, there's a reason why Jermell Charlo had so much of a competitive fight against a B or C class fighter in that of Tony Harrison, and he even lost one of those fights. I thought personally that the first fight, now of course many people would tell you that it was a robbery. I don't personally believe that it was. I thought that Tony Harrison just pulled it out in the first fight, even though it was very competitive, and the second fight was very competitive as well. And for those of you that don't know Tony Harrison, the only reason why Tony Harrison was ever a champion in the first place was because he beat someone like a Jermell Charlo. That's why, in my opinion, Jermell Charlo, so many people, they always try to make the point, oh, well, Jermell Charlo, he's just not listed as top 10 pound for pound because he's a black fighter. No, Jermell Charlo's not listed as top 10 pound for pound because he's not really that good. It just is what it is. Don't get me wrong, he's a very good fighter. But a great fighter? I'm not so sure about that. If you were a great fighter, in my opinion, at the prime of your career, you wouldn't have that loss overall to Mr. Tony Harrison. It's not like it was a Vasily Lomachenko versus Orlando Salido situation where Vasily Lomachenko, that was only the second professional fight of his career, and he ended up losing to Orlando Salido, a very experienced veteran. This dude ended up losing to a guy who never was even a legitimate 100% champion before he ended up defeating him in that first fight. I'm sorry, but if you have that type of resume, and on top of that, you have no definitive A+ wins or top 10 pound for pound wins in your career, how can you be on my top 10 pound for pound list? It just is what it is. Or maybe I shouldn't make the point overall of, top 10 pound for pound wins, because there are certain fighters on my list that they don't have top 10 pound for pound wins. And all in all, they're not, they're on my top 10 pound for pound list. Certain fighters like a Gervonta Tank Davis, who may be on my list, or, someone like a Naoya Inoue or a Josh Taylor. I think all those fighters are debatably on my top 10 pound for pound list, and they don't necessarily have top 10 pound for pound wins, but they have very decent wins in their career. At least some of them you could debate over, decent fighters, or they're very, very dominant. They're extraordinarily talented for their division, and Jermell Charlo is very talented, don't get me wrong, but that loss, in my opinion, to Tony Harrison, it does somewhat bring you down. So let me say this. If Terence Crawford was able to defeat Errol Spence Jr. dominantly, or just able to beat him in the first place, keep his undefeated record, and then move on and defeat Jermell Charlo, I think all in all, then I would probably have to rank Terence Bud Crawford as the number one pound for pound fighter. But that's if he does it in that order, or that's if overall he defeats those two fighters next, or whoever the winner of the Jermell Charlo versus Brian Castano fight is. That would be very interesting. But what I will say is this: if we're just comparing Terence Bud Crawford versus Jermell Charlo and Dimitri Bivol versus Canelo Alvarez, and I know a lot of people, they would take a look at me and they're going to say, you're crazy for saying this, you're tripping. But at the end of the day, what do I think is actually the more challenging fight between Canelo and Dimitri Bivol, or Canelo versus Artur Beterbiev, and Terence Bud Crawford versus the winner of Castano versus Charlo? I actually believe that it's Canelo Alvarez versus Bivol or Beterbiev. Why is that? Because I think that Beterbiev and Bivol, I think that they have more boxing ability and more boxing craft than that of a Jermell Charlo or of a Brian Castano. That's not me saying that Brian Castano and Jermell Charlo are not very decent fighters. But when you take a look at Artur Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol, those are two fighters, all in all, that have great amateur pedigree. They have a very great Olympic background. They're people, all in all, that have a decent resume for the amount of fights that they have. I don't think that Jermell Charlo or Brian Castano, in my view, are on the same level as some of those guys. And some people would disagree. Now, Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, is a different situation. Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, with what he's done, you could clearly argue that he's above that of a Dimitri Bivol or Artur Beterbiev, even if maybe you were to argue that maybe he lost maybe a half step or a little bit, maybe one step. I still would maybe debate that Errol Spence is above those guys, decently. So if Terence Crawford were able to defeat Errol Spence Jr., that's a fantastic win, and the Jermell Charlo is a fantastic win as well. Don't get me wrong. I just thought all in all that I would talk about this because when it comes down to it, for Terence to actually surpass Canelo on the pound for pound list, in my view, I believe all in all that he's going to have to defeat Errol Spence Jr. I don't think there's any way around it. I think all in all that's what the media more than likely is going to ask of. And overall, that's more than likely what the majority of people are going to ask for, because Errol Spence is the only one that is debatably, 100% on the top 10, probably even within the top 5 pound for pound. Jermell Charlo, he would be within my top 20, but I do not have him within my top 10. And the reason why that is because he has no definitive A-grade wins in his career. And on top of that, not too long ago, you had a loss in the prime of your career, at the best point in your career, to a B or C class fighter, to someone that was never even a legitimate champion and got knocked out a multitude of times by other fighters within the division. So how can I have you within my top 10 pound for pound?
So it sounds like to me, regardless if he gets the Spence fight or not, if he beats Spence, he's most likely moving up to 154. And he's going to try to go after the winner of that fight. So I've been waiting to hear What does Jermell Charlo think about this? Because Jermell, he hadn't said anything about this, and Crawford had been calling him out for a while. Finally, Jermell Charlo, he responds to Terence Crawford. He did a very, very long interview with Brian Custer on In This Corner, and this is what he had to say about fighting Terence Crawford. Check it out. I know all the smoke. I see y'all tooting y'all trains when I walk by. Baby, I'm looking good. I see your little light boys coming up from the 147. You got a little name, and you're making your name for yourself. Your Crawfords. Now you're Crawford. My dog live in Omaha. I know how Omaha roll. Y'all ain't never seen no real shit like this shit here. Now, I like Omaha. There's some studs over there. Now, I got highly respect for all of them. But, nigga, you got some real business to handle with them other 147 pounders. Y'all got to go out and get out the way to mess with me first. We don't know how many fights we got left. I'm not here to chase that. I'm here to chase one thing, and that's to give me.
You know, I think for Terence Bud Crawford, in my view, before maybe he would go after the unification fight at 154. I mean, well, to be fair, I believe Terence Crawford turns 35 this year. He probably doesn't have much more time. I would like to see other fights at the welterweight division like a Virgil Ortiz or a Keith Thurman. But unfortunately, I just think that Terence Crawford has wasted too much time. So unfortunately, Terence Bud Crawford, he probably is going to have to go after the unification winner within his next couple of fights. That's if he wants to be remembered as probably not only debatably the number one pound-for-pound fighter of this generation, but also if he wants to be remembered probably within that top 50 range. If Terence Crawford ends up becoming completely unified at welterweight and also completely unified at 154, he certainly will have to be within my top 50 of all time, no doubt about it.
From undisputed champion of the world at a high weight division. Now, I don't know if I'm going to do it at 160. I don't know if I'm going to do it at 154. Right now, at 154, I'm that guy.
Then I want to fight Jermell Charlo, Brian Castano winner. What's your take on that?
How about he do his best and go fight Earl Spence then? Shut up, take a little bit less money, be quiet, humble yourself, and fight Earl Spence, he a stud. Do what he say, and then you might be the challenger sometimes. These people don't know how to do that. They don't know how to be the challenger. That's his problem. He think he too high up on the horse. Bob Arum don't give a damn about him. Bob Arum told him to his face he done got lawsuits with his own promoter.
I somewhat agree overall with what Jermell Charlo had to say there. And basically, for those of you that did not hear what Jermell Charlo basically had to say, what he said is that, overall, you may have to take a little bit less money to get that Errol Spence Jr. fight. And I somewhat agree. Because it's no offense against Terence Bud Crawford, but Terence Crawford is nowhere near the draw of what Errol Spence is. That's not me saying that Errol Spence is necessarily on the same level as what a Canelo Alvarez is or anything like that. But at the end of the day, he is a clearer, bigger draw than that of Terence Bud Crawford. I mean, the last fight that Terence Bud Crawford had, when it came down to it, it was against Sean Porter. That was the biggest fight of his career. That was looked at as one of the biggest fights of the year. It didn't even do 200,000 pay-per-view buys. So I'm sorry, but Terence Bud Crawford, he's not the same draw of whatever Errol Spence Jr. is. Now, some people made the point that maybe you have to be subscribed to ESPN Plus to get the pay-per-view. I'm not really sure overall how true that is. But when it comes down at the end of the day, UFC pay-per-views are usually doing more money than that. So what does that mean? That usually means, well, of course, maybe one could argue that maybe UFC, fans and boxing fans, that they're separate. But at the end of the day, either way, what that tells me is that Errol Spence is more of a draw. So if Terence Bud Crawford, if the deal breaker is to him that, I didn't get a 50-50 split or, we should get a 50-50 split, if that ends up being the deal breaker, that would tell me that Terence Bud Crawford is not serious about getting that fight. It is what it is.
You ain't worth shit to me, for real. That mean the man didn't really care about you anyways. You should have just shut up, made the right decision with your people that love you, and then do what you gotta do. Like, it's not my fault that you can't. Hey, they got some studs. So Al Heyman only gonna sign the best of the best to me first. You got Ennis, you got Garcia, you got Thurman, you got people making a name for themselves in your own weight division. Sit your ass in your weight division and see if you can beat one of them. Cause fucking with me, you gonna get knocked the fuck out. I'm a knockout artist, baby. I ain't here to play no games and I don't get paid for overtime. So
It's interesting because Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford, they're almost in opposite situations. because a lot of people, of course, when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, they take a look at him and he's facing Dimitri Bivol next. And of course, you have a certain amount of these channels that say, oh, well, Canelo Alvarez, why the hell is he moving up? He should face Jermell Charlo and David Benavidez. They're the bigger challenges anyway. But I don't believe that. I believe all in all that Artur Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol, personally, in my view, I believe that they're the biggest challenges for Canelo Alvarez. I think that they're the better athletes. I think that overall they're the more talented fighters. I think that they're the more intelligent fighters. So Canelo moving up, in my opinion, even though they're not necessarily the bigger fights when it comes down to it, I think that it's bigger for legacy, at least for those of us that know what we're talking about. For Terence Crawford, for example, I think that moving up to 154, if you're able to beat Errol Spence Jr., if he moves up to 154, I can't necessarily blame him for doing that. But if we're just talking about overall how much of a chance Jermell Charlo actually has over a Terence Bud Crawford, I don't really give him any more than a 30 or 20% chance. And some people, I don't know, will say, well, why do you say that? And that's not me saying that the Jermell Charlo or Brian Castano win is not a great win. Personally, in my opinion, I would think that Brian Castano probably has more of a chance because I actually think that he's a more talented fighter. That does not mean that I don't think that, Jermell Charlo may not pull out of the rematch, but we'll see what happens because that is a true 50-50 fight. But at the end of the day, if Jermell Charlo versus Terence Crawford, for example, actually did happen, I wouldn't give Jermell Charlo any more than a 30 or 20% chance. I just think that he's way too hittable. I think all in all that he's way too limited. He has very, very good power. He certainly could hurt Terence Bud Crawford if he's able to hit him. But I just think that Terence Bud Crawford beats him in almost every single category. I think he beats him in hand speed. I think he beats him in feet by far. I think he beats him in head movement. I think he beats him in defensive responsibility. I think that if Terence Bud Crawford versus Jermell Charlo happened, I think that Terence Crawford more than likely would embarrass him. It just is what it is. And I don't think that he's the only one. To be honest with you, Jermell Charlo may even have his hands full, to be honest with you, with someone overall like a Duran Butenis or a Virgil Ortiz. And I'm not saying that that is just 100% what would happen with them, but Jermell Charlo, in my view, more than likely, I know for sure that he would at least get beat by Errol Spence Jr. or Terence Bud Crawford. I don't see him beating either of those opponents, but it just is what it is. But it would be a very interesting fight. And in Terence Bud Crawford, all in all, I would actually like to see him stick around 147 for a bit, maybe fight Boots Ennis and Virgil Ortiz, and maybe some of the other 147-pounders as well, because that is still a somewhat talented division, But at the end of the day, if Terence Crawford moves on, tries to become undisputed in the third weight class, I can't get mad at that either, because that's a chase for history. So whatever Terence Crawford does from here, hopefully it somewhat involves Errol Spence Jr., maybe the winner of the Castano versus Jermell Charlo fight, maybe the Virgil Ortiz as well, a Duran Boots Ennis, someone of that sort.
So it's cool.
And who knows, maybe even after that, maybe Terence Bud Crawford can make a run at 160 pounds. Now, there's no one really that good right now, 160 pounds, but we'll see all in all what he does.
Run around with your family and love your family, bro, because that's all we're doing it for. We're doing it for our family, but I take it all personal. This is a personal sport to me because I'm the only one in that ring when I get ready to match him up. So I don't see him beating me with the skills that I have and how hard I really go and how hard I train and what I really get in myself. He barely doing the stuff that I was doing in 2010. They don't even have a system.
Jermell, let me tell you this right now. Terence Bud Crawford would embarrass you. It is what it is, and I know a certain amount of people, they may disagree. Jermell, of course, is naturally, bigger. He's naturally a person that is a little bit thicker than that of Terence Bud Crawford, but Crawford is a natural 147-pounder. Don't get it twisted. A lot of people always take a look at Terence Crawford and they say, well, he came up from 135 pounds. That's right, he did. Guess what? Oscar De La Hoya, I believe, also came up from 135 pounds. That doesn't mean that he was a natural 135-pounder. Certain people overall grow out of those divisions. Not only that, but Terence Bud Crawford, he pretty much is a natural welterweight. He's a person that, he rehydrates at about 160 pounds. Whenever you have a person that their max rehydration, you pretty much subtracted anywhere from 13 to 15 pounds, and that's pretty much overall their natural weight. Terence Bud Crawford is a natural 147-pounder. And on top of that, the dude is about 5'8", has great strength, great speed, great stamina. On top of that, he has a 74-inch reach. Terence Bud Crawford is going to have no issue whatsoever, in my opinion, making the transition to 154 if he is as great of a fighter as I believe that he is. But we'll see all in all what happens.
Over there. Errol Spence right now is the most dominant 147-pounder that they got. Because why? He proved himself. He done beat everybody in the division that he can. He's stepping on top of everything that he could.
I somewhat agree overall with what Jermell Charlo said there. At the current moment, you would have to rank Errol Spence as the number one welterweight there because he has the majority of the belts and the best wins there. But do I actually think that he's going to beat Terence Bud Crawford? No, I don't. I just think that Terence Crawford hasn't beaten too many categories, and I think that after looking at the Sean Porter performance, more than likely Terence Bud Crawford is probably going to be able to withstand Errol Spence's power, because I'm not really sure if his power is the same as what it was a couple years ago, or maybe it is, and maybe Errol Spence just doesn't have that power, even though he has very good power, he has very A-grade power. Maybe all in all, he just doesn't have enough power to knock out A-grade fighters. There's just some fighters that are like that. You know, some fighters that have tremendous power, but they're not usually known for knocking out the A-grade fighters. You know, but then you have punchers like, you know, Terence Bud Crawford, where Terence, you know, he doesn't really have the same raw natural power, you know, overall, and maybe his size as an Errol Spence Jr., but his power is good enough. It's almost the same as Errol Spence Jr.'s, in my opinion. And on top of that, he may be able to knock out other people that maybe Errol Spence would not be able to do as quickly, or maybe would not be able to knock out, because Terence Crawford, in my opinion, he just knows the art of boxing a little bit more. He's a person that is a better counterpuncher. He's more accurate when it comes down to it. In my opinion, he's a little bit more multi-dimensional, or better overall with his multi-dimensional styles. I believe that Terence Bud Crawford, you know, I believe all in all that more than likely he is going to pull out at the end of the day. But we'll see what happens.
Throughout injuries, throughout tragic situations, look at Earl Spence Jr. All right, guys, so you heard it right there from the very animated Jermell Charlo. He told Crawford, messing around with me, you're going to get knocked out, but you need to fight somebody at 147 first, and that's exactly what Terence Crawford is trying to do. But when it comes to Jermell Charlo, it sounds like he's just more focused.
Well, we'll see all in all what Mr. Terence Bud Crawford tries to do. I think that the Sean Porter move was a very, very great move for his career. Let's hope all in all that he faces Errol Spence Jr. next. But we'll see what happens.
Focus on becoming undisputed. You know, it sounds like he's not sure if he's going to move up to 160 after he becomes undisputed. It didn't really sound like he was interested or that interested in a Terence Crawford fight. And then you heard Jermell Charlo talk about the whole splits talk when it comes to Crawford versus Spence, saying that Crawford needs to just be a challenger sometime. But we don't have to worry about this anymore because once again, Errol Spence, he cleared all of this up already. This fight is going to happen, guys. And the reason why I'm telling you guys...
Well, we'll see about that. When Dante's optimistic about someone that he likes overall in a fight happening overall, he always says that. But we'll see all in all what ends up happening here.
It's going to happen for sure, and it's going to happen next, is because whenever you have two fighters that both want to fight, then they're going to agree to all terms eventually, as long as, once again...
No, they're not necessarily going to agree to all terms when it comes down to it. Because like I said, Errol Spence, if he wants to flex overall his muscles and say that he is the A side and that he's going to get the better split, Terence Crawford, overall, if he truly wants to face Errol Spence, he's going to have to get a slap of reality, and he's going to have to realize that he's not the A side. So it is what it is.
You know, someone is not trying to completely price themselves out, meaning they don't want the fight at all, and I don't see Spence or Crawford doing this.
We'll see about that.
Spence, he already made it.
I hope overall for both Crawford and Spence's sake that he is correct. But we'll see what happens.
Clear. We're going to talk about all these splits and how we're going to negotiate the fight behind closed doors, which is how it should have been from the beginning. With that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. All right, now check this out, guys.
But anyways, that's really about it for this video today. I just thought that it would be very particularly interesting to talk about because this is going to be a very interesting conversation a couple years later on down the road. That is if these fights end up happening and coming to fruition. And I hope all in all that it does end up happening. Because I would love to see Terence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. have that victory in their career. But we'll see all in all what happens. Anyways, it's going to be very particularly interesting. But like I said, just to make my final point, for Terence Bud Crawford, in my opinion, to become the clear #1 pound-for-pound fighter, he has to get that victory over Errol Spence Jr., or at least a debatable #1 pound-for-pound fighter. You have to get that victory over Errol Spence Jr. There's no other win in your career that you could get at the moment overall that would make you the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. Why is that? Because Canelo already defeated a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. He's also a 4-weight division champion. That means more divisions than you. He's already going to be on his way more than likely at the end of the year to make that a 5th weight class at the cruiserweight division. If he ends up doing that, and if Terence Crawford does not end up getting the Errol Spence Jr. fight on his record, you know, that's going to be a big loss. But we'll see all in all what happens. As for the Jermell Charlo fight, like I said earlier, and I stand by this, and a certain amount of people may agree with me on this, a certain amount of people may disagree. I know I'm going to have some people on here that say, oh man, you're tripping, or oh man, how the hell could you say this? But in my view, Jermell Charlo, that's not a win that's going to propel you to the number one pound for pound spot. It may propel you overall maybe a little bit higher on my list, possibly. But at the end of the day, Jermell Charlo was not on my top 10 pound for pound list, and I'm not the only one that doesn't put him on my top 10 pound for pound list, and I already explained why he's not. So it is what it is. Jermell Charlo, I think, is a very decent fighter. But Terence Crawford versus Jermell Charlo, pretty much, that's almost like, I guess if you were to compare it, kind of like when Canelo Alvarez, in my view, fought a Callum Smith. Now, some people may say, well, I believe overall that it's greater overall than that fight. I don't personally believe so. And the reason why that is because Jermell Charlo, he already has a loss in his career. There's a blueprint overall about how to beat Jermell Charlo. And I'm sorry, but Jermell Charlo, he was even lucky enough to get out of that fight last time in a fight that he probably should have lost to Brian Castano. So it is what it is. So in my view, when you're fighting people like a Dimitri Bivol and also someone like an Artabitabi, two people that in my opinion are actually better all-around fighters than a Jermell Charlo, and two fighters that are undefeated, if Canelo Alvarez ends up doing that within the next couple of years and Terence Crawford only gets a win over Jermell Charlo and there is no Errol Spence Jr. victory, in my opinion, that will even put Canelo Alvarez on a higher plateau than what he is at this point in time. So we'll see what ends up happening. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later, and we'll see where this ends up going. But I'm going to really hope for Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. that this fight ends up happening for the both of them. But we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.